Oh, hi, I'm Nick Fraser, and what we're going to do in the next hour is to look at two things. We're going to look at a project called Why Poverty, but we're also going to discuss, hopefully with your assistance and your participation, how you do cover things like global poverty in the media. And I have to firstly apologize that I'm here chairing this because the person who was supposed to chair it didn't show up. So I think we have to do this session in a slightly different way. I'm a participant, but a chairman at the same time. So I have a sort of schizophrenic role in the next hour. But I hope you'll assist me by asking me extremely difficult questions. I'm Nick Fraser. I was one of the executive producers of Why Poverty, and I'm editor of BBC Storyville. And this is Mette Hoffman, who is one of the executive producers of Why Poverty, who's head of documentaries at DR, that's Denmark's radio. Mark Galloway is director of the International Broadcasting Trust, who is a very forthright critic of the way poverty is covered in the British media. And Helen Yiannakopoulos is a lecturer of international politics and development at the Open University, who is also, by the way, one of the real stars of Why Poverty. That her reading of the films was fantastic, and she helped us more than I can say. But I'm going to start off by asking Mette, will you play us into this by talking a bit, firstly about Why Poverty, and then what it did in Denmark, and show a bit of Stealing Africa?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but we tried to, the trailer was not ready, so we had a very, very good trailer telling about these 8 films that we produced, Nick and Don Atkins and I. And what we wanted was basically to try and see if we could create local debates around the world, as many places as possible, and scale it up to global awareness. And you know, we eventually produced these 8 films. We spent 4 years ensuring that we got as many broadcasters as possible, because we believed in public broadcasting, but also that broadcast is the mass media. So we got eventually 70 broadcasters from around the world showing these films in last week of November. And of course, in addition to that, there was lots of outreach and education material and online in the various countries. In the Arab countries, we worked with MBC, the biggest Arab satellite broadcaster. They had 40 million viewers. They created an Arab website. The same it was done in South America, Brazil, and all over. Also Africa, we had the biggest satellite channel, ETV, as a partner. And what we then tried to do, in addition to the satellite, BBC World was huge, also a good partner, was to ensure that we had terrestrial broadcasters as well. So we had Palestine TV, Jordan TV, and if some of you saw Sola Mama, that was shown there and had a lot of debates, of course, in these countries.
Okay, so you want to show us a bit of...
No, because I can do that. Yeah, okay.
Do that.
You got impatient. We have an hour.
No, just talk to us a bit.
Sorry, I'll talk less.
No, don't talk less, but
okay, we're going to show a clip. One of the film, it's called Stealing Africa. And it's basically showing with a case story how an enormous sums of money is leaving Africa. And I remember when I pitched that to people and also talked to people about this story, they always said, oh yes, but it's all the corrupt politicians. It's actually, it's estimated that only maybe 7-8% is good, for corruption, and not only to the African leaders and management, but just corruption. Then they say, oh, it's the Chinese. But actually, till now, even though the Chinese are getting into Africa, it's around 10%. So the rest is actually money being stolen out of Africa with not paying royalties and taxes, and if they pay royalties, very little. And it's told through a case story in Zambia, copper mine, and Glencore is the owner of that company. And I don't know what the clip is, but let's just run it. It's a Danish director.
The Zambian copper mines were privatized and sold to foreign investors in 2000.
It is fair to say that of all the frauds that occurred in Zambia during President Chiluba's time, the privatization of ZCCM was one of the most significant.
The privatization process has never been officially investigated for corruption, but the president at the time, Frederick Chiluba, was sued by the Zambian state for misappropriation of funds in the London High Court in 2007. Michael Sullivan represented Zambia in the case against Chiluba.
President Chiluba was found liable in damages to the Republic of Zambia in the sum of $46 million for conspiracy to defraud the Republic and for breach of fiduciary duty. A very living example concerns the purchase of extravagant shoes and suits from, in particular, one named Boutique Basile in Geneva. There was spent over $1.1 million, and the clothes which were purchased were found during the investigation into state corruption. I've seen them myself. There were 11 trunks. I mean, I have the list of what was found in the trunks, and you have 206 designer suits, 185 shirts, 36 jackets, 157 trousers, and 64 pairs of shoes, and 74 ties. Now, all these ties were designer ties, mainly coming from Switzerland and Italy. So there you have a graphic example of the nature and extent of the corruption.
A very interesting beginning of this film that I had hoped was also there is that it's this guy from Glencore. He lives in Switzerland, and you know they have this direct democracy there, so they vote for everything and anything. And the mayor there is telling us he had a call that they would receive 320 million or something, enormous amount of money. Was he prepared to get that into his bank account? And he said, of course, yes, he was very happy. And he calculated that they could lower the tax in that region with 7%. But then there were some citizens in Switzerland who figured out, well, all this money, they come from Africa, and they have not paid any royalty for taking up the copper or taxes. So we should give some money back to Africa. So what he suggested is citizen that they should lower the taxes with 5% and give 2% back to Africa. And then everybody came to the town hall to vote, and it's kind of telling a lot about, you know, what if it gets close to us, what will we do? And obviously there was sort of everybody, they wanted a 7% tax deduction, and I think it was 6 who wanted to give 2% back to Africa. So that way, that was a really amazing scene about what it means when it gets closer to us. Yeah.
I go to Helen. You were Open University participants in White Party. What did it really do for you? How did you use the project?
Well, first of all, the Open University is unique because it has a social mission as well as educating students who come to us, and we are involved in series like Why Poverty as part of that mission. For us, well, for me personally, I think it's been my favorite thing that I've worked on in the last probably throughout my whole career. But one of the things that we do in our teaching is teach about the relationship between, you know, the North and the South, and that these lines are blurred, actually, and poverty is a structural issue. It doesn't just happen over there, it happens over here as well. And this series really captured that, you know, that there are structural reasons why poverty exists. And I think, for me, that's the most powerful thing that's been in the series. We've used it in our teaching, and we're going to be using it more in our teaching. My own personal research is on this area, on the way that media, you know, the role of media and development kind of tie together. So I think it's very powerful for our students, but also for viewers, to look at the causes of poverty and to look at a very broad range of topics, because I think it's very easy to say, oh, just give some money and that'll fix it. Poverty is very complicated. It's a very complicated issue, and I think what the films do in this series, excuse me, is tap into a number of different approaches to looking at poverty.
So we should show a bit of clip 2, Pour Us, right?
Soon.
Hello. One of these people are you. You've had a long day at school. Or was it the office? Maybe you were shopping. Now you are home. Relax. Maybe you want to watch television.
These people live in constant fear of eviction. They had already been forced
See
out
what's
of previous slums.
In this place, people die so we can get mobile phones.
You've heard it all before, haven't you?
Children working as slaves.
You feel a mixture of sorrow and cynicism. The world is richer than it has ever been, and yet there seems to be more poor people than ever.
Economies have been on the edge of a financial and economic precipice.
You are falling asleep. You're going to have a strange dream. It starts with this thought. If we want to make poverty history, then first we need to understand the history of poverty. Your dream starts in a library full of floating books. There are voices that seem to come from the books and speak to you.
Poverty, wealth, power, powerlessness are connected.
Poverty isn't solved automatically by growth.
What can we do for them, or what do they need? That's a question which is a little too general in a sense, because there is no one answer.
You are a prehistoric girl or boy, you choose, and this is your family. Dad doesn't have a car, mom doesn't have a fridge, and you don't have an iPod. But there are plenty of wild animals. So you are trying to work out if you are rich or poor at the start of human history. At least everyone seems equal. You're hungry, so Dad gets dinner.
If you wanted to write a big history of poverty, you could divide it into 3 or 4 different chapters. And you would start perhaps with the hunter-gatherer. A hunter-gathering lifestyle has a lot of great advantages. It really takes very little labor to gather enough food, enough calories to live. And to that extent, if what you like doing is lying on a beach in a nice place, it's a wonderful lifestyle. But it is not a lifestyle that is secure.
I think at this stage I've got to stop pretending I'm the chairman of this debate and ask Mark to take over and grill me about the BBC's performance in this.
Okay, well, yeah, let's come on to that in a minute. I just think we should go back to the question, can the media do anything about global poverty? I think
Right.
there are and we've done a lot of research in this area at IBT. And the first thing to say is that television is the main source of information for most people in this country about what's happening around the world, despite the huge growth in the internet. When people know something, they might go online to find out more. but television is the main source. So what television does is hugely important. So first of all, we need to look at what television does and what works and what doesn't. And secondly, we need to think about how can television inspire or encourage action, because there's no point just showing people stuff and then them not doing anything about it. And I think what's interesting about the Why Poverty project is that it departs from the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom amongst broadcasters is that this is a difficult subject that you don't tackle head on. You smuggle it in, and you enable audiences to make connections. So you make television, there are a number of different examples that we could come up with that show what television mostly does. One example is the experiential documentary, so something like Toughest Place to Be, where you send a British firefighter to the Amazon to fight fires, and through his experience and his story, we learn what life is like for other people in other countries. It could be a taxi driver or a dustman, and that works for audiences. And those sort of films do get bigger audiences, but they probably don't lead audiences to take action. We've done some audience research, actually. There's very little audience research in this area, surprisingly. We published this report, The World in Focus, which is available on our website, where we actually showed audiences clips of different films to try and understand what will encourage people to watch documentaries or other programming about poverty and development and what's happening in other countries. And this research is a few years out of date, and it would be good to do some more research. It was published in 2009. But it's very interesting how, for a UK audience, when they think of global poverty, they think of the stuff that they watch on the news, and they think of comic relief, and they think of charity appeals for disasters. And they think, oh my God, this is heavy, it's worthy, it doesn't speak to me. And that's a huge barrier for audiences that discourages them from watching films about poverty. And our research found that, yes, actually, audiences need to make connections with their own lives. So I think it was interesting what Helen was saying about how if audiences can understand that poverty isn't just something over there, that it's part of us and the lives we lead. So yeah, I do want to challenge you, Nick, because when I first heard about the Why Poverty project, I got very excited. I remember you saying, this is something that we want to reach mainstream audiences. And I think the BBC let you down. They put these films on BBC 4 for a niche audience, people like me who already are interested and want to watch these things. And they didn't make any noise about the season. And the thing that our research has demonstrated is because there's this barrier that's stopping people from watching, you've really got to go out and find the audience and make lots of noise so that people notice it and they think, oh yeah, I will go and watch that. So why did the BBC let you down and not make enough noise about this?
Well, it's the first thing I should say
It's
is
a mystery.
It is a mystery. It is a mystery. And
so you agree that they did let you down?
I think unhappy would be an understatement. However, I should say first that, using the Dickens formulation, it was the best of times and the worst of times from Tale of Two Cities. The BBC did not let us down over BBC World News because these shows are on their second showing now on BBC World News, and they are reaching really huge audiences all over the world, and they outperform the run of programmes on BBC World News. Like, plainly, throughout the world, there are up to 40 million people a show happy to watch these shows. Going back to the story in the BBC, this was signed up by everyone in the BBC to do a pan-BBC effort based on Why Democracy, which we'd done before and was successful in quite a niche way, but quite a mainstream way. And the films were supposed to be shown across different channels. And I think two things have happened. Firstly, there was a massive loss of nerve caused by Jimmy Savile, of all things. And you may ask, what's the connection between Jimmy Savile and world poverty? Well, there isn't really a connection, except organisations like the BBC fall into trauma when they're confronted with the level of disaster implied by the whole Savile story, and they don't make decisions. And secondly, circumstantially, a lot of people the people who backed this series disappeared from their jobs, either because they had to resign as Director General after a rather brief tenure, or they'd gone to work for the New York Times. So there was a series of unfortunate coincidences. But I don't think this is enough of an explanation. I think fundamentally that you're right. There is a basic nervousness that occurs in big broadcasters, not in Scandinavia, by the way, but in big broadcasters like the BBC. But it was even worse in America, by the way, when it comes to poor people. They say consciously or not, we don't want to show poor people. That's
well, I think there's also a nervousness at the BBC about being seen to somehow be campaigning.
Well, whenever this show was mentioned by the head of BBC World News, told me, whenever she had a conversation with anyone else at the BBC, and I did, their reaction is, why poverty? Oh, that's a campaign, isn't it?
Well, because they're thinking of make poverty history and
Correct.
the mess that they got themselves in over that. But I think the BBC is stuck in the past. They need to move forward. And what's interesting is actually in the charter, if you look at the charter, one of the purposes of the BBC is to encourage citizenship and active citizenship. So on the one hand, the BBC wants to encourage people to watch television and do something, and then it has a project like this, which is a perfect opportunity to watch television and do something, and it ties its hands behind its back.
Well,
I think that is true. I think that it's also how straightforward you go out. And I think it's not only in Scandinavia, because what we could see with Why Poverty was that broadcasters around the world, whether it's Hong Kong, Taiwan, Brazil, Canada, around the world, but in particular also in Scandinavia, where, we have a management say our job is to empower people with knowledge, but not in a boring way, or, to enable us to understand the interconnected world we live in and all these things. And I just think because I think it's really a pity that BBC missed out, because I think that what Danish people are looking at is more or less the same as, looking at the world and how the interest in the world. And I can say all the 4 years trying to sell the idea of Why Poverty to broadcasters, it was uphill. It was really uphill. I mean, it did, because all broadcasters...
I don't think it was as difficult as selling democracy, though.
No, because they were afraid of the political balance.
Yeah.
But it was uphill because it's a boring subject and, nobody will watch it. But as soon as they got the idea of sort of thinking, some of them, thinking, okay, we can do something bigger than ourselves by working together. We can get these great films, particularly because Nick's editorial brain is involved. And, we can get people to watch them by making something more, like a theme week. And at DR, I was very lucky. We had actually a program planner employed 8 months before this, and she came from the commercial TV station, and she said, we're going to do this big, and they really did it big. Every night in the news, they had small stories connected to the films we were showing the same evening. Stealing Africa had 600,000 viewers. We have 5 million. 1/3 of the Danes watched one or more of the films. So, 1.7 million, we have 5 million people. And we did an external independent survey, because it was interesting. It's the first time we really did base a theme week on documentaries. And 76% of the Danes knew about this debate. Half of them took part of the debate by talking to other people. And I think it was 54, 57% changed their minds about the importance of debating inequality and poverty, but also gained more interest in the subject. And, it's just all our analyzed people say it's just amazing figures because, you know, to get people to change their mind about anything is more or less always impossible. And so and that's what films can do, you know. Films can get people engaged and understand things in a different way. And these 8 films has sort of, you know, as you said, different subjects, and they got into, you could say they lean to the 2015 goals, but it's about child mortality, it's about educating children and tax evasion. So it has many subjects, and it was amazing to see how many got involved. We did sort of trick people also. We served in many factories poverty lunches, and then we had sort of quizzes that they could answer on statistics and stuff. And so we actually reached out to people we normally maybe, as you said, would not be interested in poverty. And what else did we? Had lots of radio programs and high school debates and town hall debates also, with citizens coming into the town halls and debating inequality in various places. So you can do many things, and I think it's really such a pity, you know, that it was just neglected by.
I wonder how much of it though is also, I mean, all of those things that, you know, make the Danish. And it's not just the Danish case.
No, but it took place in many countries where they did different
but I wonder
things.
how much of that also is the way that the UK public responds to poverty. And I think what Mark was just saying about, you know, the images of poverty that we see are news images, which are by definition negative, appeals by the charity sector, and actually, unfortunately, and quite recently, this kind of reverting back to these really problematic images of the starving baby. And you know, I think that doesn't predispose people then to possibly watching films like this. But I think, you know, with that work, it can change the work that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think also one thing that I was different to normal poverty was that we wanted to actually disregard the global north sending money to the global south, because we think that it is interconnected. But also, if you look at the American film, The Park Avenue, it's about. Do we have a clip?
Yeah, we got a clip out of Park Avenue.
About inequality in America, where you know, they're selling the American dream.
Shall I just talk? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a great film, by the way, and actually my horror and dissatisfaction at the BBC's performance was partly mollified. I love this film because it's the most fantastic full-on attack on very rich people in America and their political lobbying and the way they don't give a shit about poor people but aim to conserve their own fortunes. And it, to my great satisfaction, the series didn't eradicate poverty, but it came close, the series, to destroying PBS, because there was a huge article in the New Yorker, the reverberations, no it didn't really, but the reverberations are still going on. And I think it was some achievement to get this film on American TV, because these are not the sort of views you'll find anywhere on American TV. So I hope the clip illustrates them.
What is the clip?
I don't know.
No. That's interesting. Okay, do you see?
This stretch of Park Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan is the wealthiest neighborhood in New York City. This is where the people at the top of the ladder live, the upper crust, the ultra-rich. But this street is about a lot more than money. It's about political power. The rich here haven't just used their money to buy fancy cars, private jets, and mansions. They've also used it to rig the game in their favor. Over the last 30 years, they've enjoyed unprecedented prosperity from a system that they increasingly control. But if you head north for about 10 minutes, this Park Avenue comes to an end at the Harlem River. On the other side of the water, there is another Park Avenue. This is the South Bronx, home to America's poorest congressional district. There are 700,000 people in this district. Almost 40% of them live in poverty, making less than $40 a day. From here, the last 30 years have looked very different than the view from Manhattan's Park Avenue. People here have seen their wages fall and the cost of almost everything else go through the roof. They've lost their jobs in the recession caused by bankers across the river. They've watched their children struggle in failing schools. And they've ended up even worse off than they were a generation ago. But America is still a land of opportunity, isn't it? A place where anyone can make it to the top if they're willing to work hard and set their sights high. That's what makes this country great. Isn't that what we tell ourselves? But in today's America, what are the chances that someone who starts their life on this Park Avenue will end up living on this Park Avenue?
Let's imagine that you're invited to a game of Monopoly. And you arrive at this game to find out that all of the property's been divided up. All of the money's already been handed out. But you're told, hey, go ahead and sit down, play the game. We're gonna give you a chance to play just like everyone else. There are some in society that have a lot of access, a lot of social mobility, a lot of resources to do the things that they want, as opposed to other people who are more disadvantaged, more underprivileged, don't have the same levels of resources.
Well, there you go. That's contemporary America. I think we should do we want to hear what you have to say. Like, we want to hear what we like to know. Any questions from you, but also kind of what you think about how these subjects should be covered on television. Anywhere. Yes.
Thank you. Do you think sometimes that the reason the message isn't quite successful as you want is that you're just a bit too hectoring with the way that the message is put, and almost exemplified how you've communicated with each other, that it's all sort of, it is seen as the way that the message is delivered is because it's it is an important message, but it's almost thrust down people's throats sometimes and that actually puts people off the way that they hear the message. I think, I find, as somebody who's worked in the industry.
I've worked, that's an interesting point, the kind of the worthiness sometimes of films. But I think I worked on a series about 7 years ago, I think it was in 2005, called African School. And it was a great series, and it was very much, 10 half-hour episodes of kids in Uganda, and the aim of it was to show, and it had never been done before, to show normal life in Africa, that it's not all about AIDS, conflict, and death. That kids have normal lives even though they live in countries that might be poor, and the viewer figures for that were really low. It had critical acclaim, but again, it was really difficult to get that. So comparing it to this, which is, that's just my own personal experience. I'm sure other people have.
Well,
so why do you think this is more, or it's not, or it's less sort of into?
We made it as, it was very light, and it was very entertaining. The series, the African School series, and even then we didn't get.
No, because I think you have to be extremely honest about these things. If you want to talk about poverty, you tell, this is a film about inequality and poverty. And if you want to talk about porn, you can do that, so people know what they're getting. And it's, as a public broadcaster, I think you really have to say, we want to discuss this with you. We have inequality in all our countries, and this series was not only about Africa, and that's what made it so exciting, I think, and also why we could get so many viewers in of course, obviously we market it in a different way it was in Britain.
But I think the context in Britain is very different. I agree with what you're saying. I think the grammar and the tone is very important, and there's an audience sensibility that's put off. It's quite an interesting example recently on BBC Two, Welcome to India, and Keo Films, who made that and made Hugh's Fish Fight and Meet the Natives. Their view is, I mean, there isn't just one way of approaching this, and I think we need a number of different ways, but their view is that you need to inject a sense of fun, and that sounds odd, fun in a slum in India, but they did manage to inject a sense of fun, and it got quite a good audience. But I don't think we should get obsessed about audience figures. Audience figures are often very hard to interpret. You can have a lot of publicity, like Inside Syria, Ollie Lambert's film that he was talking about in the last session. A lot of publicity, good slot, and you only get 500,000 viewers. If you put something on BBC 4, it will get fewer viewers than on BBC 2. It's just a function of the fact that a lot of people don't...
The ratings in terms of BBC 4 and BBC 1 were not terrible at all. I mean, one of the films got 2 million on BBC 1, and these were absolutely in line with ratings on BBC 4. Plus this one about Park Avenue outperformed BBC 4 usually, and I would also say, however, I don't know what, I mean, I'd like to know what you'll think rather than what I think, but I don't think these films are hectoring. Actually, as Meta says, they're saying there are poor people, there are rich people. If you want to do something about poverty, this is what you can do, this is what's keeping people in poverty, what's getting them out of poverty. The film Solar Mamas that was shown here, you can go and see it in the library, is the furthest you can get from a hectoring film. It's a very beautiful film. I would say the point of all these films, apart from showing structural things, is to say that actually when you look at the lives of so-called poor people, they're just as interesting as our lives. You know, there's a basic solidarity, common humanity, and they can be interesting. But anyway, any more questions? Yes?
Many questions.
Loads of questions. Go on.
It's a question particularly for Mark. IBT's documented how television has changed. You've documented it more than anybody in terms of the outlets and the approach to development and poverty. Have you seen that there's been a corresponding change from the audience? You talk about people's attitudes to poverty. You've shown how it's been truncated terribly, the coverage, but has it really changed people's attitudes?
Yeah, and that's a great question, actually. I mean, there's a lot of research about people's attitudes to poverty, and there's a big piece of research, and I mean, Helen knows, you're better to talk about this than me, the Make Poverty History campaign. In the period of that campaign, there was a significant shift in attitudes to poverty, that people were more engaged with it as an issue during the campaign and at the peak of the campaign, around the G8 and so on. But then they carried on asking the same questions for the following year or two, and they found that then the level of interest dropped. So interest or engagement at the moment is quite low. Is it because we're in a recession? If you're interested in this issue, there's a great piece of research that's been done by ODI and IPPR, trying to tease out what the public thinks about poverty. And it's a complex issue. The media plays a role. How politicians speak about poverty plays a role. And the nature of people's lives. But just to return to the issue of television, we have documented that. And I think it's very alarming to me how the space on television to cover international issues is smaller and smaller. I mean, Meta talks about, we need broadcasters to be honest with audiences, say this is a film about poverty and we're going to show it at 9 o'clock on our mass audience channel. We can't get our broadcasters to do that. And we're talking here about the BBC. But Channel 4's track record is even worse. Yeah. Channel 4 had a documentary strand called True Stories that had lots of international films. Now it has virtually no international films.
Having trashed the BBC, I feel obliged to defend them.
You didn't trash it at all.
But can I finish my point, Nick? I think there's
Stops
a
me
failure
interrupting you.
of leadership from the broadcasters. We need the broadcasters to be braver and give us a more varied diet on television and not always be fearful of, oh, well, the audience won't like this, so we're not going to show it. There's a real conservatism and a lack of ambition. And I think Channel 4 is in a worse place than the BBC.
Okay,
But
I've got to respond to this. Look, I agree about Channel 4, but that's part of their abandonment of public service broadcasting. Okay, but I have to say that I don't quite agree with you about the BBC. If you add on BBC Radio, BBC News coverage, actually the reporting from, it's not direct reporting about campaigns about poverty. The reporting from the developing world is unrecognizable. It's so much better on the BBC than 10 years ago. And actually, I don't have figures obviously, but I'm quite often watching BBC News at 10. And I think here's actually a very sophisticated show out of what we used to call the developing world. I also have to say to you, okay, Storyville is on BBC 4. Sometimes it's on BBC 2, but we're getting pretty decent audiences for shows that would never have been on British television 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, shows about India, shows about China. It's
Actually, Nick, I agree with you about television news. One of the striking trends in television news is that whereas the newspapers have got less interested in international stories, television news has maintained its interest. And you can watch the News at 10 on BBC One, which is the highest rated mid-late evening show, and 50% of the time slot will be foreign stories. I think there is a worrying trend in television news, which is the narrowing of the range of stories, that we throw lots of attention on the big foreign story of the day, and then when we've had enough, we move on. There's only space for one story, and those off-agenda pieces that present a different picture of poverty are now not being shown on mainstream TV news.
Yes.
Do you believe Alex Gibney's argument in Park Avenue that the denizens of Park Avenue have a lot of power, and if so, aren't they the audience that we ought to be considering? In other words, not that we ought to care about them as an audience, except that they have the power to put pressure even on BBC, and especially on PBS, not to place these kinds of programs. And thinking about the rest of the audience isn't going to get us very far if we have people with a lot of power putting that kind of pressure through politics, but also directly around the business table.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think we, in our business with documentaries, we really have a dilemma because we're doing a survey at the moment, or I am, with some students. We are trying to figure out, and the tendency is that if you don't have a strong public broadcaster who's only there to cater for empowering knowledge to the people, like in the old-fashioned public service, you actually, if you go through the countries like, Berlusconi, Rai, and even PBS and so, where we know David Koch tried to stop the whole poverty screening, that's parallel to inequality and a lack of social mobility, where you have small public broadcasters or where they are controlled by either strong politicians or by money, as they are in America. So that is, of course, really dangerous. And at the same time, we have filmmakers who wants to make films that are also not catering really. They actually, TV window is the last in their wish to cater for showing their films. So I think we have a dilemma there because it is still public broadcasters who are feeding people with knowledge and who wants to do that, and without any actually, that's the only thing they have to do. And it's interesting that, that it goes parallel with mobility of social mobility and so on.
Next question.
Hello. I very much agree with you that the BBC's effort in this project does seem a bit half-assed. But I'd like to talk of a...
Try not to be too hectoring, please.
Sorry. A recurrent dilemma in journalism is that philosophically, BBC's role as a public service is by definition controversial. to act as a public service requires a degree of pedagogic reasoning. You need to assign a purpose, and you need to identify what is valuable, and you need to identify your ends and pursue them, and pursue what you perceive to be valuable, which is not a democratic process. Whereas the BBC cannot be neutral whilst also pursuing those ends. I'd like to talk about the America example. You spoke about the conservatism and the lack of ambition in the BBC, but when we talk about a film such as that American one there, it's easy to forget that in America, a film like that is particularly controversial because Republicans, particularly libertarian Republicans, see wealth redistribution as fundamentally immoral. I mean, Robert Nozick famously said that taxation is akin to slave labor, it is theft. Many Americans truly believe that. I think we're all in agreement in this room that some type of wealth redistribution is required in the world with its current state. But when you've got Americans taking that attitude that it is theft, it's a very political issue. And for a broadcaster to pursue ends that are so divisive and potentially political, especially a public service as the BBC when it's trying to maintain a facade as a neutral organisation, are those two ends not incompatible and almost impossible?
I think this is a very
great question.
It's a very great question. It'll probably take a whole book to answer.
But it's not only Americans, you know.
But
Having said that,
also, in shorthand, the BBC doesn't sustain impartiality, and it's not obliged to be neutral about things like racism. It is absolutely permitted and encouraged, and it has been from the beginning of the BBC, to give voice to opinions. And the opinions of Alex Gibney are perfectly okay on the BBC. It's perfectly okay to make shows saying that inequality is a damaging thing. They just have to be well documented, well argued, and conform to certain standards of journalism. So.
And you have to say that has been really one of our struggles. Is we have two films where we had big companies. Glencore's lawyers they were after us, and David Koch in America, and it was a lot of legal, like much more than we actually had budgets for to try and present all these underlying documentations to the broadcasters and to the people in the films.
I think you make a great point, and the mess they've got themselves in over citizenship is an illustration of the contradiction, that on the one hand the BBC is supposed to make programmes that encourage people to do something, but on the other hand it gets anxious about what is the something that people do in case it's political.
Well, Mark, we'll take another question here, but how would you think the BBC should resolve this question?
Well, I think people at the BBC need to be talking about it and thinking about it and having it out in the open. But I think they put the red line in the wrong place. And you can see that with the BBC websites now, have this brief to encourage people to go to other sites. But they don't mind encouraging people to go and read an article on the Daily Telegraph website, but they don't want to encourage people to go and read a blog on an Oxfam website in case that's campaigning. So I think that the line is in the wrong place.
Thank you.
Yes, the back.
I worked in the non-profit sector for about 15 years, and I was often sitting on the other end of the telephone when I got a call from Channel 4, BBC or wherever, wanting to make a series with us on a variety of different issues. And my experience was that it was always problematic. So one example was I did a big season with Channel 4 on adoption, and they put a lot of money into promos and publicising it and a huge online element, and I couldn't criticise them for that, but in terms of where my organisation was sitting in, the programming content was hugely problematic. It oversimplified the issue. You talked a bit before about, using starving baby images and this kind of thing. It even went so far as they had promised us a small budget to do some outreach work, which ended up getting used by the production company because they overspent their budget. So I just wondered, my question is, how can we make these relationships better between broadcasters and the non-profit sector?
Golly.
Yeah, no, I think that's another great question.
That's a killer question.
Broadcasters are essentially top-down organisations, and they don't work very well in partnership with other players in the outside world. So I think I mean, I work a lot with NGOs in the development sector, and I always say to them, if you're in a relationship with a broadcaster or even a producer, make sure the rules are out in the open at the beginning, so there's a sense of accountability. So if you talk about images and we don't want you to use these images, then they need to say, well, maybe we will, or yes, we definitely won't. And there are producers here who can talk about this, and I think there needs to be a more open conversation about those sorts of things.
I think we should ask Helen what she thinks before you get my one-liner.
I'll say more than one line. As an academic working with broadcast, there was a steep learning curve, which was that basically academics try to make things more complicated, and I'm being very blunt here, and broadcasters, there was a tendency to oversimplify. Now, I don't think that's the case with these films at all. This is how it can work. And I think it's a dialogue, and it's a learning curve and a dialogue, and actually understanding that, this is what makes good telly. And this is, and the kind of the academic, I used to work for an NGO as well, and NGOs and academics can bring that depth to it as well that might not be there. In this case, it wasn't. These films do not suffer from this. But I have worked on other projects before where, we used to have this fellow colleague of mine, and I used to say, we can take anything interesting and make it boring as academics. It's a gift, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think there is a learning curve, but it's a dialogue, I think, and I think that develops over time. But I think I would encourage actually that interaction, even though it can be difficult.
Melly, you want to speak to this question?
Yeah, no, we actually don't work with NGOs, and we don't cooperate. We cooperate and we don't collaborate on the films. We think it's important, as also in principle with the political influence, that it is an arm's length to any interest organization or individuals or politicians. So we try to cover the cost ourselves. When the films then are completed, then the NGOs can work with them as they wish. But I find that the NGOs are quite lazy in that respect. It's sort of, they're never really for them, or they don't say pay money here. And so I wanted to say, we did also another survey that the fact that this, why poverty is not what is it you call, we're not collecting money in the end, and we're not asking people to be part of a movement. These analyzing people said that the films had a stronger impact because of that, because they could watch the film, they could think about it and go away and then figure out what they wanted to do. But they were not sort of, tunneled into some specific reaction.
And NGOs couldn't have made this film.
Couldn't?
They couldn't have made these films. I think the institutional interests, NGOs have a mandate that is to promote a particular point. Yeah. And only broadcasters could have made this series. I think there could, that's not to say that collaboration is to be written off, but I think the actual films, the way they're made, had to be made by broadcasters.
Question.
Hi. From what you've all said, it feels like a lot of the problems that you perceive in media helping poverty comes from broadcasters being top-down organizations and things like, and the politics of that. How do you think platforms like YouTube, which operate differently, could help in the gap that broadcasters aren't filling?
YouTube. Yeah. No, and these films, as I said, they are out on YouTube, and they are out on all the broadcasters. A lot of them have them on their website. And as I said in the beginning, we had 33 million tweets, so it's all sort of being distributed on the social media. I don't know what you mean about they are on YouTube. You can go and watch them, but
I'm thinking more about content which is made for YouTube rather than made for broadcast.
A lot of the content was made.
Oh yeah, we versioned a lot to make it fit into YouTube and mobile units in Africa and everywhere. So there are so many versions of each film. And there's a lot of shorts also.
Whypoverty.net, and it's got 30 shorts that were actually made for YouTube. Yes.
I'm probably not going to express this very well, but I will try. It was more just, I would be interested to know what you thought about
what I sort of perceived as a tension between an arguably quite sympathetic portrayal of poverty in the global south, whereas there's a lot, I would say, less sympathetic coverage of poverty at home, so particularly in the UK. For example, the Channel 4 programme Skin, which arguably is not a very good portrayal of many things. Anyway. So do you think anything can really be done about global poverty until we become aware of or accept the fact that poverty in the UK or in the global north is part of that same global structure and those same problems that poverty in the global south is caused by?
Well, I thought that was a fantastically lucid question, but I can't answer because I don't know enough.
Well, they did Poor Children, BBC.
Yeah.
Poor Kids, Poor Children, an amazing program about poor children in England. We copied it in Denmark.
No, it had 3 children, and it was the True Vision film.
No, there was one as well that focused on one sort of younger person, an older teenager in their 20s.
Can we overrun? Can we go on for an extra 5 minutes?
On the whole, I do feel that the portrayal of poor, which is, I hate to use that word, but poorer people in the UK for comic effect, and that Skin programme is horrible.
Yeah, I mean, this series doesn't do that. Actually, that's one of the advantages. I think that's one of the really kind of innovative elements of this series, is that actually the way that you define the problem, right, of poverty, I think affects the way that you portray it. And the way that it's defined in this series is that it's a global systemic problem. And when you have films like Park Avenue, you have films like One Born Every Fourth. Welcome to the World. Welcome to the World.
Yeah.
You know, and a number of other films do show the relationship between, you know, that they're actually the reasons why people are poor here are related to the reasons why people are poor in the South as well. Obviously, there are differences.
The Chinese film about education was sort of inequality in education and the privatization of education. And, you know, in principle, you should be able to transfer that to anywhere else where you have, you know, privileged, rich kids going to private schools and awful schools for poor kids. So you know, it's sort of, with some imagination, you should be able to transfer the challenges.
Well, we got Jahan.
What do you think the most positive effect of the series was?
To work with you, Jahan.
No. Obviously, but you know, besides
that. Two filmmakers of Solar Mama here.
But yeah.
To me, it was 4 really hard-working years, but what's amazing is now you see that the films are being shown in, I mean, I met a woman from Mexico, and these films are out everywhere in Mexico, in schools and universities and in squares and, you know, all these things, and there's a local website, and I think these things are amazing, you know, get mails from Taiwan and everywhere. We know in China that the films they get out, they're what's it called, forbidden in China, is it called that? Banned, censored by the Chinese authorities, but people continue putting them up on some websites, and in 3 days it was up somewhere, it had 2.7 million viewers, and then it was taken down, and then it pops up again. And that's, of course, also really rewarding that it gets out places where we would not imagine. And you know your own story about when the films were shown in Jordan, how other Jordanian talks about it. And I think this is actually what we hope for. The film about tax evasion is shown in Zambia now, where Zambian people can look how the whole system is and how all their money goes to Swiss banks. And I have to say also systemically there are changes. OECD is looking into more transparent banks has to open up, and countries that has not opened up before with, you know, who has money in their banks, and country by country reporting. So there are reactions. Whether it comes from why poverty, of course we don't know, but some of it I'm sure is because there's a lot of ministers and so who has also seen the films. The EU, we have shown them in the EU, we have showed them in UN. We have sent the boxes to your Prime Minister and to Obama and other places. We just send them to their addresses, so maybe they see them. I think, but to get these reactions from normal people and young people around the world it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Nick, didn't you?
Yeah, I have to sign off. So in my double role, I'd say, look, you build prototypes and the prototypes fly and they do wonderful things. They may not perform quite as you intended them to, but they're still wonderful. And I think of these films as just opening one door after another. That is, they open doors for different people. And I also think that, I think maybe you don't need in the future to do so many films or so many attempts to treat poverty as a whole. I think what I would like to see is not films where poverty is smuggled into other types. I think this is a complete waste of time and it patronizes the audience. I'm sorry, I'm probably not very good at popular entertainment, but I would just like to see greatly superior reporting of all these matters, because these matters are not about something separate called the poor world. They're about things that concern all of us, and any young reporter in his 20s will watch these films and figure out another 30, 40 stories that you can do about these subjects that are extremely interesting. And that's my hope, really. In the same way as Why Democracy was a wonderful prototype to be used by reporters, to be used by citizens, I think this is the case with this series too. And in the end, that's what's really valuable for me.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Why Democracy, where, I had this mail from a Taiwanese saying, oh, thank you so much to have films from whereby you can discuss what democracy is in a new democracy is amazing. So, it's all these that's what films can do. Film can change people's minds and hearts, and they can live for a long time because they have a huge impact, I think, more than if you read statistics and
Mark, do you want to say how we should take things on from here?
Actually, you made the point I was going to make. I think Why Poverty achieved is it showed that you can take a difficult subject like poverty and you make a really watchable film like you made. I mean, Solar Mamas is my favourite of all the films. And I think we need to make the case to the decision makers that you can make really good documentaries about these subjects that can be played in prime time and that people will watch. I think there's a dangerous trend where you always have to have a format, as Nick said, or you put the documentaries away on a channel that not many people watch. I think we need to campaign for documentaries to come back into prime time. For me, Solar Mamas should have been the one that was shown on BBC One.
Helen,
For me, as an educator, you periodically get the student that says, this changed my life. And it does happen. And that, after you kind of weed through the kind of repeating things that people do when they're doing courses, this changed my life is one of those things that you really hold on to. And I think the key for me in education, but also with series like this, is that it actually enables people to say, I'm thinking about this differently now. That critical thinking, I think, is key. And to actually take something like, we didn't talk about this film, but the one about campaigning with Bono and Geldof, and to say, this makes me look at this differently. That critical thinking, for me, is key in any documentary. But I think this does it. These films do it really well on each issue, in each film. So that's what I take away. I'm sure there are people out there that say, maybe this didn't change my life, but I'm looking at this differently. And I think all the films do that. They kind of challenge some assumptions about the way people think.
Yeah, you can all go online, whypoverty.net. Yes. You can share the films, they're free. You can use them in schools. Commercial time.
Yes, you're being hectoring again.
That's
well,
not
more
hectoring.
important, you can all go.
That's selling.
You can all go off and make your own films about this. You can,
yes, it's a good idea.
Can add to it. You can, you can work in whatever medium you like, about the subject and find different ways of doing it. Feel liberated. There we go. Thank you so much for coming.
Hectic.
Thank you so much for such great, penetrating, difficult to answer questions.